The sun was setting over Omu Village, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. A warm breeze carried the scent of roasted corn and fresh palm wine from the market. Women laughed outside their homes, while children ran barefoot on the dusty roads. But in the middle of this peaceful village, there stood a mansion. A mansion no one dared to approach after dark. The mansion belonged to Obena, the wealthiest man in the village. He had land, power, and more money than anyone else. But his name was spoken in whispers. Why? Because his wives kept disappearing. Obena had been married 3 times. Each time his bride vanished without a trace. His first wife, Ada, disappeared, one night leaving behind only her wedding gown. The second, Chinwe, was said to have run away, but no one ever saw her leave. The third, Ifunaya, was rumored to have died mysteriously. Some villagers believed Obena sacrificed them for his wealth. Others were too afraid to ask. Now, Obena was preparing for his 4th wedding, and this time his bride was Inkim, the kind and beautiful daughter of a poor farmer. She had no idea. She was walking into a trap. The day of the wedding arrived, and Omu Village buzzed with excitement. The streets were filled with music, the rhythm of drums echoing through the air. Women dressed in bright colors danced, and men raised their cups of palm wine in celebration. At the center of it all stood Inkim, dressed in a stunning red and gold gown, her dark hair braided with coral beads. She was beautiful, but her heart was uneasy. Obena, her soon-to-be husband, stood proudly before her. He was tall, with a powerful presence, his wealth displayed in the heavy gold rings on his fingers. He smiled, but there was something cold in his eyes. "Inkim, my dear, today you become the most fortunate woman in this village," Obena said, placing a delicate necklace of coral beads around her neck. The villagers cheered, but Inkim felt something strange. The moment Obena's hands touched her skin, a shiver ran through her. The air around him felt wrong. She looked at the mansion in the distance. Even in broad daylight, it loomed over the village like a shadow. Still, she forced a smile. Her family was overjoyed. They had been poor all their lives, and this marriage was a blessing. Her parents hugged her, thanking the gods for Obena's choice. But deep inside, Inkim felt trapped. As the wedding ended, Obena took her by the hand. It was time to enter the mansion. As soon as she stepped through the heavy wooden doors, a wave of cold air hit her. The inside of the mansion was massive, filled with expensive furniture, golden decorations, and strange artifacts from distant lands. But something was missing. There were no servants, no voices, no laughter. For such a grand house, it felt empty. Obena led her through the hallways. The walls were lined with old portraits of people with lifeless eyes. One painting in particular caught her attention. A woman in a wedding dress, her face half hidden in the shadows. "Inkim, are you all right?" Obena's voice broke the silence. She quickly nodded. Yes, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Something about the mansion made her skin crawl. Later that night, as she lay on the enormous silk-covered bed, she felt it again, that unsettling presence. She turned to Obena, who was already asleep. The room was silent. But then, a whisper. Faint, almost like the wind. "Inkim!" Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, scanning the dark room. No one was there. Her heart pounded. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was her imagination. But deep inside, she knew. She was not alone. The day of the wedding arrived, and Omu Village was alive with music and laughter. Women in brightly colored wrappers danced, their feet pounding against the dusty ground in rhythm with the beating drums. The scent of roasted meat, palm wine, and burning incense filled the air as the villagers gathered to witness the grandest wedding in years. At the center of it all stood Inkim, dressed in a stunning red and gold gown. Her dark hair was braided with coral beads, and golden bangles jingled softly on her wrists. She was beautiful, glowing like a goddess under the sun, but her heart was uneasy. Beside her, standing tall and proud, was Obena. His white ceremonial robe shimmered, his fingers heavy with rings of gold. His smile was wide, his voice deep and rich as he spoke to the guests. "Inkim, my dear, today you become the most fortunate woman in this village," he said, placing a delicate necklace of coral beads around her neck. The crowd cheered. The village elders raised their hands in blessing. But as Obena's hands touched her skin, a shiver ran through Inkim's body. The air around him felt wrong. She glanced toward his mansion in the distance. Even in broad daylight it loomed, like a dark omen. The windows, tall and narrow, resembled watchful eyes. A flock of crows circled above the roof, cawing loudly as if trying to warn her. Her parents, however, were beaming with pride. They had struggled all their lives, and now their daughter was marrying the richest man in the village. "Inkim, you will never suffer again," her mother whispered, squeezing her hand. But Inkim barely heard her. Her thoughts were clouded by a strange, growing sense of fear. Still, she forced a smile. The wedding continued with music, feasting, and laughter. The villagers danced deep into the evening, oblivious to the growing unease in her heart. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Obena took her hand. "It is time to go home, my love," he said. And with that, Inkim stepped into the mansion, her new home, her prison. As soon as she crossed the threshold, a wave of icy air surrounded her. She shivered, though the night was still warm outside. The doors shut behind her with a heavy, echoing thud. The inside of the mansion was massive. Gold-trimmed furniture, towering bookshelves, and crystal chandeliers. Strange artifacts from distant lands were displayed in glass cases. But despite its beauty, something was wrong. There were no servants, no sounds of movement, no welcoming voices. For such a grand house, it felt empty. Her footsteps echoed loudly as Obena led her through the hallways. The walls were lined with paintings, portraits of men and women dressed in fine clothes. But their eyes, they felt real. One painting, in particular, made her skin crawl. A woman in a wedding dress, her face half hidden in the shadows. Her eyes were wide, hollow, filled with silent fear. "Inkim, are you all right?" Obena's voice broke the silence. She swallowed and nodded. Yes, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She wanted to run. But where? The first night that night, she lay in a massive bed covered in silk sheets. The room was luxurious, but she felt no comfort. Obena had fallen asleep quickly, his deep breathing steady beside her. But Inkim couldn't sleep. The silence of the house was suffocating. The shadows on the walls seemed to move when she blinked. Then, a whisper, soft, barely there, "Inkim." Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up, scanning the room. Nothing. She squeezed her eyes shut. Maybe she was imagining it. Then she heard it again. "Inkim." This time it was closer. She turned her head toward the mirror on the far side of the room and froze. In the reflection, there was a figure behind her. A woman, dressed in white. Her face was twisted in silent agony, her hollow eyes locked onto Inkim's. Inkim spun around. No one was there. Her body trembled. The room felt colder, the air heavier. Slowly, she turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, and this time she raised a shaking finger, pointing to the locked door in the hallway. Inkim sat frozen, her eyes locked on the mirror. The ghostly woman did not move. Her hollow eyes were fixed on Inkim, her pale lips parted as if trying to speak. Then, in a slow, jerking motion, she raised her hand. Her bony fingers trembled as she pointed toward the locked door at the end of the hallway. A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, though the windows were shut. The candle on the bedside table flickered violently, then died. Darkness swallowed the room. Inkim gasped, scrambling for the lantern. Her fingers trembled as she lit it, casting flickering shadows against the walls. She turned back to the mirror. The woman was gone. The only reflection staring back at her was her own. Her heart pounded. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her? She turned to Obena. He was still fast asleep, his breathing deep and steady. No, this was real. Something was very, very wrong with this house. That was just the beginning. Over the next few nights, strange things kept happening. She would wake up to the sound of whispers, soft and sorrowful, like women crying. At first she thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew clearer. "Run, Inkim! Save yourself." One night she woke up to a faint creaking sound. She held her breath, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside her bedroom door. She turned to Obena. He was still there, breathing deeply. Then, the doorknob turned. Inkim sat up quickly, her heart racing. The door didn't open, but something pressed against it from the other side. A shadow moving in the candlelight. She could hear breathing, heavy, raspy. Then, just as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The next morning, Inkim told herself it must have been a bad dream. But when she opened the door, there were muddy footprints leading away from her room, and they were too small to belong to Obena. Inkim tried to ignore it. She tried to convince herself she was imagining things, but the more she tried, the more the house refused to let her forget. She started noticing cold spots. Certain areas of the house were freezing, even in the hottest part of the day. One afternoon, while Obena was away, she wandered through the hallways, her bare feet silently brushing against the cold stone floor. Then she came across a particular room. The door was slightly open. A cold draft whispered through the crack. Slowly, she pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a bedroom. But unlike the rest of the house, this one was bare. No decorations, no furniture, except for a single wooden chair. Placed in the center of the room, the air felt thick, heavy, like something was watching her. She turned to leave. But just as she stepped out, the door slammed shut behind her. A shiver crawled down her spine. And then she heard it. A faint rustling sound. She turned her head toward the chair and saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Hanging over the back of the chair was a white wedding gown, neatly folded, untouched by dust. It looked new, as if someone had just placed it there. Then, a soft voice whispered behind her, "He will take you too." Inkim screamed and bolted from the room. She ran down the hallway, her breath sharp and uneven, her hands shaking violently. Something was terribly, terribly wrong, and she had to find out what. She thought of the woman in the mirror. She had pointed to a door at the end of the hallway, a door that Inkim had never seen Obena open. That night, after Obena had fallen asleep, she gathered her courage. With a lantern in one hand, she slowly crept out of bed and made her way down the dark corridor. Her bare feet made no sound. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The air around it was ice cold. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. It wouldn't turn. Locked. She stepped back, her breath fogging in the air. Then, suddenly, a thud. Something slammed against the door from the inside. She jumped back, gasping. Then another thud. And another. Like something trapped inside was trying to get out. She turned to run, and then the whisper came again. "Help us!" Inkim froze. Her heart pounded violently. She took a step closer, and for the first time, she noticed something scratched into the wood. A name. Ada. The name of Obena's first wife. Her stomach dropped. The realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. Obena's wives never left. They were still here, and they were trying to warn her. Inkim's breath came fast and shallow. Her heart pounded in her chest. The name Ada scratched. Into the wood burned into her mind. The first wife. Her fingers trembled as she touched the rough engraving. The air around the door was freezing. She needed to know the truth. Inkim turned, hurrying back to her room. She had to wait for the right moment. That moment came the next night. Obena had left the mansion for a meeting with the village elders. The house was silent, filled with only the soft sound of the wind outside. Now was her chance. Inkim crept through the dimly lit hallway, her lantern casting long shadows along the walls. Her steps were silent, calculated. She had seen Obena place a set of keys in his study before. If any key could open that door, it would be there. She reached the study. The massive wooden desk stood in the center of the room, covered in old scrolls, ink pots, and a single silver dagger. Her eyes scanned the surface. There. A small iron key rested beside a wax-sealed letter. She reached for it, but as her fingers curled around the metal, a floorboard creaked. Her body went rigid. Was someone there? She turned sharply, eyes darting across the room. Nothing, but the air felt different. She didn't waste another second. Grabbing the key, she rushed out and made her way toward the locked door. The cold was worse now. The air was thick, pressing against her skin like unseen hands. With shaking fingers, she fit the key into the lock. Click, the door creaked open. A narrow stone staircase spiraled downward into blackness. A musty smell, like damp earth and decay, rose. From below, her lantern barely illuminated the bottom. She hesitated. Every part of her screamed, "Turn back! Leave!" But she needed to know. She stepped down. With each step, the darkness grew heavier. The cold seeped into her bones. Then, a whisper. "Inkim." Her breath hitched. It was right beside her ear. She spun around. No one. She swallowed the terror clawing up her throat and kept going. At the bottom, the basement opened into a large chamber. The stone walls were lined with candles, half melted, wax dripping onto the dirt floor. The air smelled of rotting flowers and something metallic. And then, she saw them. 3 wedding gowns hanging neatly on a wooden rack. Each one pristine, untouched by time. She didn't need to guess who they belonged to. Ada, Chinwe, Ifunaya, Obena's missing wives. Beneath the dresses, a small wooden chest lay partially open. With dread pooling in her stomach, she knelt beside it and slowly pushed the lid. "Bones," she gasped, stumbling back. "Human bones." Her stomach twisted. Obena hadn't lost his wives. He had killed them. And then, a deep voice echoed from the staircase. "Inkim!" Her heart stopped. Obena was home. Footsteps echoed down the stone steps, slow and deliberate. She backed, away, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream. Obena appeared at the top of the stairs, his face calm, but his eyes cold. "Inkim," he said again, stepping down. "I told you, some doors should never be opened." She looked around, desperate for an escape. Obena stepped closer, blocking the staircase. "You should not have come here," he continued. His voice was low, almost amused. "But I knew you would. They always do." Inkim's blood ran cold. "They!" She clenched her fists. "You killed them." Obena chuckled, a deep, hollow sound. "I did what was necessary," he said. "Wealth, power, these things demand sacrifice." Her hands shook. "They were your wives. They were offerings." Her stomach churned. Obena took another step forward. "And now, my dear Inkim, it is your turn." No, she refused to die here. With a sudden burst of courage, she grabbed a candle from the wall and threw it at him. Flames burst to life as it hit the wooden floor. Obena roared in anger, stepping back as the fire spread. Inkim didn't wait. She ran. She raced up the stairs, her breath coming in short gasps. Behind her, Obena shouted, his footsteps heavy as he chased after her. "Inkim!" his voice thundered. "You cannot run from me!" She burst into the hallway, her bare feet pounding against the cold stone. The shadows moved. The whispering voices grew louder. "Run! Run! Run!" She reached for the front door. Locked, Obena's voice was right behind her now. "Inkim," he said softly. "Come back." She spun, searching for something, anything, to defend herself. Then she saw it, a small black idol sitting on a shrine near the staircase, the source of his power. Obena followed her gaze and his face darkened. "Inkim," he warned. "Don't." She didn't hesitate. With all her strength, she lunged forward and grabbed the idol. A dark energy shivered through her fingertips. Obena screamed. The mansion shook violently, the walls cracking. Inkim raised the idol above her head and smashed it against the floor. A deafening wail filled the air. The flames roared higher, consuming everything. The whispering voices grew into a chorus of screams. Obena fell to his knees, clutching his chest. His body withered, his skin turning gray like ash. "You don't understand," he gasped. But Inkim didn't listen. She turned, kicked open the door, and ran into the night. Behind her, Obena's mansion crumbled, the flames swallowing it whole. The spirits were free, and Obena's reign of terror was over. Inkim ran through the village, her breath ragged, her feet raw from the rocky path. Behind her, the distant roar of the collapsing mansion echoed through the night. Obena was gone, but the terror was not over. She had nowhere to go. Who would believe her? Then, through the shadows, she saw a flickering light, a small hut at the edge of the village. She stumbled toward it and pounded on the wooden door. "Please, help me," she gasped. The door creaked open. A frail elderly woman stood in the doorway, her wrinkled face lined with wisdom and concern. "Inkim," the woman whispered. Inkim's blood froze. How did she know her name? The old woman led her inside, shutting the door quickly. The air smelled of herbs, smoke, and something ancient. "Sit, child," the woman said, stirring a pot of something thick and dark. "I have been waiting for you." Inkim's heart hammered in her chest. "You know what's happening?" she asked, her voice shaking. The old woman nodded. "Obena's curse has lasted too long. The spirits of his wives, Ada, Chinwe, Ifunaya, were never at peace. That house, that power, was never truly his. It belonged to the dark force he served." Inkim shuddered. "The idol," she whispered. "I destroyed it." The woman turned to her sharply, eyes glowing with an eerie fire. "Then the curse is broken," she murmured. "But child, you are not safe yet." A chill ran down Inkim's spine. "What do you mean?" The woman gripped her hand tightly. "Obena's death has freed the spirits of his wives, but the dark force he served is not gone. It will come for you." The hut shook as a gust of wind howled through the night. The fire in the clay pot flickered violently. Inkim's stomach knotted in fear. "What can I do?" she whispered. The old woman placed a small carved amulet in Inkim's palm. "This will protect you," she said. "But you must do one last thing. You must summon the spirits and send them to peace." The fire crackled. The shadows shifted. Inkim took a deep breath. She was ready. The old woman led Inkim to a clearing in the woods. The trees whispered in the wind. The moon cast a cold silver glow over the ritual circle drawn in the dirt. In the center, the woman placed a bowl of crushed herbs, white chalk, and a single burning candle. "You must call their names," she instructed. "Call the spirits home." Inkim's throat tightened. She stepped forward, her voice trembled as she whispered, "Ada, Chinwe, Ifunaya." The wind stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, a cold gust of air whipped through the clearing. The candlelight flickered wildly. They were here. 3 ghostly figures materialized in the circle. Their forms were pale, almost transparent, but their eyes… Inkim, one of them whispered. It was Ada. Her face was no longer twisted in fear. She smiled sadly. "You freed us," Chinwe murmured, her translucent fingers brushing over the amulet in Inkim's palm. Ifunaya nodded. "But the darkness still lingers." Inkim's heart pounded. "What must I do?" she asked. The wind howled again, and a shadow formed beyond the trees. It moved unnaturally, stretching and twisting, its presence freezing the air. The dark force. It was here. The old woman grabbed Inkim's wrist. "Now! Call upon their strength!" Inkim clutched the amulet and screamed, "Ada! Chinwe! Ifunaya! Help me!" The spirits turned sharply, their eyes flashing. The shadow lunged. A deafening shriek tore through the clearing. The spirits rose, their forms glowing with a golden light. They rushed forward, colliding with the dark force. The air rippled violently. The trees shook. The shadow fought back. But this time, it was not strong enough. With a final piercing wail, it collapsed inward, twisting and writhing, before disappearing into the night. The wind stopped. The trees stilled. The spirits of Obena's wives stood before Inkim. Their eyes, once filled with torment, now held peace. "It is over," Ada whispered. Chinwe smiled softly. "We are free." Ifunaya stepped forward and gently touched Inkim's cheek. "Live, Inkim. Live for us." And, one by one, they faded into the light. Inkim stood in the clearing, the silence heavy around her. Tears streamed down her face. It was over. The old woman placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are stronger than you know, child." Inkim took a deep breath. The village would hear the truth. Obena's dark reign was over, and now Inkim could begin again. The first light of dawn broke over Omu Village. The sky, once covered in darkness and fear, now glowed with a soft golden hue. Inkim stood at the edge of the village, staring back at the place she once called home. The mansion was gone. Nothing but blackened ruins remained. The cursed shadow that had haunted the land for years was finally gone, but she knew the scars would remain. She walked slowly into the village square. The people were already awake, gathering water, preparing food, laughing, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just hours ago. Then they saw her, her torn dress, her bare feet covered in dust and scratches. They stared, whispered, "Inkim?" Someone finally spoke. She nodded. Her voice was hoarse, but she forced the words out. "Obena was a murderer." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "The mansion is destroyed," she continued. "I saw what he did. He sacrificed his wives for power, and he almost did the same to me." The villagers exchanged fearful glances. Some still refused to believe it. But then, from the distance, an old woman stepped forward. The village healer, the same one who had helped Inkim. "She speaks the truth," the woman said firmly. "The spirits have been set free. The darkness is gone." Silence fell. And then, a quiet sob. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth, tears spilling from her eyes. "My sister, Ifunaya. She never ran away." More whispers, more realization. The truth had finally surfaced. Justice and a new beginning. That evening, the villagers gathered where the mansion once stood. They lit fires, burned incense. They called the names of the lost wives, Ada, Chinwe, Ifunaya, so their spirits would never be forgotten. Inkim stood among them, her heart heavy. She had survived, but the memories would never fade. As the flames crackled, she whispered, "I will live for you." And in the wind, she thought she heard them whisper back, "Thank you." Some say the land where the mansion stood remains cursed, that on certain nights you can still hear whispers in the wind, voices of those who were never meant to die. But one thing is certain: evil, no matter how powerful, will always fall. What do you think? Do curses really exist? Would you have survived if you were in Inkim's place? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay safe and beware of doors that should never be opened.